She didn't see their faces, only the laughter, the sneers, the sound of boots against wood and the sting of burlap scraping against raw skin. Nora had a sack over her head, rough, unwashed, reeking of rot and mold. They didn't even let her walk. She was thrown onto the back of a wagon like livestock, ribs cracking under the weight of their disregard. She'd screamed once, just once, and that single sound cost her a breathless gasp and a broken bone. Now, she was silent. Not from fear. No, not anymore. But from survival. Because silence was the only power they hadn't stolen yet. And they thought if they couldn't see her face, she'd be easier to sell. Less human, less trouble. But Nora was fire buried under ash. She still breathed. She still burned. They brought her to a place no one would remember. A dusty town, somewhere west, somewhere cruel where names don't matter and mercy doesn't live. The auction yard reeked of sweat, tobacco, and something older, more bitter. She heard voices, casual and amused. One man joked, "What's under the sack? Hope she ain't cross-eyed." Another yanked her forward like a stray dog. $15, someone barked. Strong, young, good for field work, or breeding. Let that sit with you for a moment. $15. For a life, for a woman, for someone's daughter. They didn't see a person, they saw utility. Her wrists were bound in front, her ankles bruised from rope, her stomach twisted, not just from hunger, but from the way her body was being appraised like cattle. She thought of her mother. How she used to braid Nora's hair and hum softly about the future, a future that never came. And then the bidding started. Fast, cold, inhuman, 17, 20, 25. She could feel herself slipping, fading, into the numbers, like a name erased with each call. "I'll take her for 30, a man near the front said. "If she stays quiet." You know, in history books, we often hear about the systems of slavery and cruelty in terms of laws, dates, amendments. But we don't talk enough about the moment-to-moment dehumanization. The mechanics of how a person is stripped of everything, not just their freedom, but their dignity, their name, their right to speak. That's where this story begins, in the dirt, in silence. With a woman in a sack being sold under the hot sun and no one, not a single soul, speaking her name. But the fire in Nora hadn't gone out. Not yet. And as you'll soon see, that fire was about to change everything. Have you ever felt invisible? Like your voice didn't matter? Imagine what it would take to reclaim it, to stand even when everything has tried to break you. Because for Nora, this was just the beginning. And then out of nowhere it happened. Just as the auctioneer raised his gavel, ready to seal Nora's fate with the crack of wood against wood, someone in the crowd spoke. "That's my wife." 3 words, calm, clear, and somehow louder than the jeers, louder than the numbers, louder than the silence she had been buried in. The whole auction yard froze. You could feel it in the air. Heat suspended, breath held. The auctioneer barked back, "Who said that?" But Nora, her breath, caught. She couldn't see through the sack, but every part of her, every bruised inch turned toward that voice. Then came another command, low and sharp. "Take that sack off her head. She doesn't belong here." Light pierced through as the cloth was yanked away. Nora blinked, eyes burning, the faces blurred. The crowd stood still. And from the front stepped a man, tall, lean, covered in dust, with a fury in his eyes that wasn't loud but certain. Steady. "She's my wife," he repeated. Nora didn't know him, had never seen him before, but something in his voice, something in his lie, felt more true than anything else in years. And in that moment, with nothing but instinct to guide her, she nodded. "Yes, I'm his." Why did she do it? Maybe it was survival. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was the first time someone had spoken for her instead of about her. Whatever it was, it changed everything. The auctioneer tried to laugh it off. "She don't seem to recognize you." But the man didn't flinch. "She's been through hell," he said. "That doesn't change who she is." Think about that for a second. What kind of courage does it take to step into a lie for the sake of someone else's truth? The man, his name was Dini, didn't yell. He didn't threaten violence. What he did was worse for them. He threatened exposure. He said, "You want papers? I'll bring you the man who forged the ones that put her here. He's in this crowd. I'd bet on it." That shook them, because sometimes power isn't in fists. It's in knowing the right things, saying them the right way, and making people question everything they thought was safe. Nora still didn't know who he was, but he never looked away. Not from her bruises, not from her wrists, raw from the rope, not from the shame they tried to bury her under. And finally, when the silence stretched too long, the auctioneer relented. "Fine, take her. But if you're lying, I won't stop the sheriff." Dion nodded once, tossed a few coins on the ground, then, "Consider this my last bid," and walked toward her. He didn't grab her. He didn't act like a savior. He simply knelt and cut the rope from her ankles, then asked quietly, "Can you walk?" She could have collapsed, could have cried. But instead she stood, and they walked, through the yard, through the crowd, past every man who'd once thought they could own her. No one dared stop them. For Nora, it wasn't about being saved. It was about someone recognizing her humanity in a place that had stripped it away. And in a world where silence was the safest option, she chose to speak. She chose to belong to a lie that gave her back her truth. That walk, dust on her feet, pain in her ribs, pride in her posture. That walk was the first step away from what they tried to make her, and into who she was always meant to be. Freedom doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it walks beside you in silence, never asking for thanks. And sometimes it comes in the form of a man who offers you water instead of control. After the chaos of the auction, after the lie that set her free, Nora didn't know what to expect. But what she found was something she hadn't felt in so long. She almost didn't recognize it. Space. Dean didn't ask questions. He didn't talk much. He didn't press for her story or her gratitude or her name. He just walked beside her, quiet, steady, and let her breathe. They stopped by a shallow stream nestled under cottonwoods, where the water ran slow and cold. He knelt to fill his canteen, his hands moving with the kind of calm that only comes from pain long carried. Without looking at her, he asked, "You hungry?" Not like a demand, more like an offer, a choice. Nora hesitated. Her body still expected cruelty with every kindness. But she nodded. He handed her a biscuit, plain and wrapped in cloth, and they sat in the shade like two people who didn't owe each other anything, except maybe the truth. That's when he told her that when he was a boy, they took his sister, sold her, just like Nora, and he'd been too small to stop it. But he'd made himself a promise that day, never again. And maybe that was the first time Nora felt it. Not safety exactly, but something just as rare. Recognition, not for what she could do or what she could endure, but for who she was. A person, not a price tag, not a tool, not a field hand or breeder or commodity. Just Nora. You ever been around someone who doesn't flinch when they see your scars? Who doesn't turn away when they notice the damage? It's disarming. Healing even. Because in a world that's quick to label and quicker to forget, being seen fully and still accepted is revolutionary. Iani didn't offer her answers. He didn't wrap her in soft words or try to play the hero. He simply made room for her to exist without explanation. And that was enough. They walked together, without speaking, the rhythm of their steps forming a language of its own. She wasn't his wife and he wasn't her savior. But in the silence between them, something sacred began to take root. Not romance, not obligation, just the quiet dignity of being allowed to be. And maybe that's what true freedom feels like. Not flags waving or grand declarations, but a moment beside a river, a biscuit shared, a story offered without expectation, The sense that for the first time in a long time you don't have to run or shrink or pretend. You can just sit and eat and breathe. For Nora, this wasn't the end of her story. It wasn't even the beginning. It was the moment between, the pause between survival and rebirth. And Dean, with his quiet strength and broken past, was the first person to make that pause feel safe. Not because he saved her, but because he didn't ask her to owe him for it. And sometimes, that's the most powerful gift of all. You don't rebuild a life in one grand moment, not in a speech, not in a single act of courage. You rebuild it in the quiet repetition of small things, chopping wood, boiling stew, stitching curtains out of old grain sacks. That's how Nora began again. The cabin sat nestled between cottonwoods and pine, worn by wind and time. Nothing fancy, just one room, a slanted roof, and a porch that creaked with every breeze. Dean had built it years ago, after his sister was taken, hoping she might one day return and need a place to land. She never did. But Nora did. And for reasons neither of them said out loud, he gave it to her. Not with pity, not as a favor, just as space to become someone again. At first, Nora didn't know what to do with that kind of freedom. She'd spent so long being told what to do, where to stand, when to speak, how to breathe. That silence felt strange, almost unbearable. But something in her began to shift. Not quickly, not dramatically, but honestly. She started splitting kindling with hands that still bore the bruises of rope. Her palms blistered, her arms ached, but every swing of the axe said something that words couldn't. I exist, I am not broken, I can build something. She cooked meals, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to. Rabbit stew, cornbread, boiled roots. And when Deanie came in from the field, dust on his brow, and saw the table set, he didn't praise her or minimize it. He just asked, "You did all this?" She nodded. "You don't have to cook every night," he said. She smiled, just a little. "I know." And then she said something that stayed with me. "It's the first time I've made something that stayed mine when it was done." That hit me, because how many of us spend our lives giving, our energy, our labor, our love, only to see it taken, erased, forgotten? What does it mean to create something that no one else can claim? One day, Deanie handed her a small parcel. Inside was a silver comb. Simple, not delicate, just solid. When she asked why, he said, "Because when you walked into town today, you didn't look afraid. That deserves something." And he was right. Fear had lived under her skin for so long it had become part of her posture, her voice, her breath. But that day she held her head a little higher, not because the world had changed, but because she had. Nora began to remember who she was before the sack, before the auction block, before the world tried to erase her name. And not just remember, reclaim. Through every chore, every splinter, every quiet meal at the wooden table, she stitched together a new identity. Not someone else's version of her, not a victim, not a possession, but a woman in her own right. What's the first thing you would do if you were truly free? Not just free from cages, but from judgment, fear, expectation. What would it look like to rebuild your life, one quiet task at a time? For Nora, it wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering the self they tried to take from her, and realizing it had never truly left. It had just been waiting, quietly, patiently, until she was ready to rise. Some ghosts don't come in the dark. Sometimes they ride up in broad daylight, dressed too fine for dusty trails, wearing smirks that carry the weight of old power. That's how he came. Lyle. A name Nora had never spoken out loud, but one. Her body remembered the moment she saw the glint of his belt buckle through the trees. He didn't come by accident. He came with a purpose. And that purpose was to drag her back. "Afternoon," he said, smooth like oil. "This the Ward homestead?" Nora didn't call for Deanie. She didn't step back. She stood right there, hands steady, breath slow. Who's asking? He tilted his head like she was being cute. Name's Lyle. I work for a man who remembers you. Says you left owing him something. Let that sink in for a second. Owing him something. Nora didn't flinch. Then he should have remembered. I don't belong to him anymore. See? That's the kind of line you don't say unless you mean it. Unless you've earned it. And she had. Every bruise, every splintered board in that cabin, every early morning she chose to wake up and fight for her own name. It had built to this moment. Lyle leaned forward in the saddle, grinning. Brave talk. You think that cowboy behind the axe can protect you forever? Nora didn't even look back. He didn't save me. I did that. He blinked. Not because the words were loud, but because they were true. And truth, when it finally speaks after years of silence, has a way of rattling even the most arrogant bones. That's when Deanie appeared. Silent, steady, one hand on a hoe. His voice was flat as the land behind him. You're trespassing, and if you're threatening her, you're not leaving with your boots. Lyle looked between them, weighing his odds. But Nora stepped forward, just enough that he had to. Look her in the eyes again. Tell your boss, she said. If he wants something from me, he can come ask himself. But I won't be gagged. I won't be leashed. And I sure as hell won't be covered again. Her voice didn't shake. And for the first time, Lyle didn't speak. He just pulled his reins and turned to ride away. But not before muttering, You'll regret talking like that. Nora didn't miss a beat. No, she said. I regret not saying it sooner. After he was gone, Deanie turned to her, hand gentle on her arm. You didn't need me, he said quietly, and she nodded. Not this time. I needed you behind me, not in front. That moment, it wasn't just about defiance. It was about ownership, not of land, not of status, but of herself. Nora did more than stand. She shattered the silence that had chained her. And in doing so, she made sure that no one, not Lyle, not his boss, not the law or the past, would ever mistake her for property again, because power doesn't always come with armor or weapons. Sometimes it walks barefoot across a porch, speaks clearly, and refuses to bend. Sometimes power is a woman with no chains, no sack over her head, and nothing left to fear. And that kind of power? It doesn't just free one person. It shifts the whole ground beneath them. There's a moment in healing, quiet and unannounced, when survival stops being the goal. When the bruises have faded, the nightmares lose their grip, and you start asking a new question. What now? For Nora, what now meant work. Real, honest, backbreaking labor. Not the kind forced on her with threats and chains, but the kind she chose. She rose with the sun, chopped firewood with blistered hands, turned soil with tired arms, and cooked meals with quiet pride. The cabin she lived in didn't just protect her. It became an extension of her own rebirth. Every nail she hammered, every curtain she stitched whispered the same truth. This is mine. But that would have been enough only for a little while, because Nora wasn't just rebuilding a life. She was shaping a new kind of womanhood, one grounded not in what had been taken from her, but in what she now claimed. And then came Anna, just a girl, 16 maybe, pulled through the dirt by a man twice her size. She didn't cry, didn't scream, probably had those instincts beaten out of her already. But Nora recognized that look, that stillness, that silence that comes when you've accepted you don't matter. So she stepped between them. That girl's not yours, she said, steady and low. And when the man scoffed, when he laughed like cruelty was currency, Nora didn't argue. She turned to the girl and asked the only question that mattered. Do you want to leave? Anna didn't know how to answer at first, but then she nodded. Just once. And that was enough. Nora reached for her hand, and something remarkable happened. Power shifted. Not with fists, not with violence, but with choice. That night, Anna sat by the fire in the same place Nora once had, shaky, silent, unsure of whether kindness would come with a price. But it didn't. Nora didn't smother her with comfort or force conversation. She let her be. Let her breathe. Because Nora understood something most people don't. Saving someone isn't about making them feel grateful. It's about giving them space to choose themselves again. And here's what's beautiful. Nora didn't become a protector because someone gave her permission. She didn't wait for society to name her worthy. She became that person because she refused to let another girl walk the road she had to crawl. Nora never called herself a hero. But to Anna, she was something rarer, proof that freedom is possible even after the world tries to crush you. That scars don't make you weak. They make you dangerous to people who count on silence. And here's what really stayed with me. Nora never needed to be chosen. She chose herself, over and over again. And in doing so, she gave other women permission to do the same. That's the kind of power no one can buy or steal. That's the kind of legacy that echoes. Change doesn't always come because someone in power grows a conscience. More often it comes because someone without power refuses to stay quiet. For years, the auction yard had stood untouched in that dusty town, wood worn smooth by boots, and desperation by hands dragged and voices silenced. People passed it every day. No one questioned it, until they had to, because women like Nora stopped whispering. At first, it was small. A few neighbors talked, quietly, about the girl who'd once stood on that platform and now walked freely through town with her head high. She didn't come to ask for pity. She didn't explain herself. She bought flour, thread, and walked out. And that unsettled people. In a world where someone like her was supposed to disappear, she didn't. And then the law changed. No more human auctions. Not because lawmakers suddenly found morality, but because too many women had stood their ground, and the silence that protected the system cracked under the weight of their existence. It wasn't Nora alone, but she was part of it, an undeniable part. Her story passed from porch to parlor, shop to church pew. People stopped referring to her as that girl. Now they said her name. Some in admiration, some in discomfort. But they said it. And at the edge of the woods, where the road narrowed and the trees whispered like witnesses, stood a small wooden gate. Dean carved a sign into it by hand, slow and careful. The words weren't fancy, but they were true. The Ward Place, home of the woman who wasn't bought. Nora didn't ask for the sign. She didn't even know it was being made. When she first saw it, her fingers traced the letters like they were sacred. And maybe they were. Because in a world that had once stamped her with a price, this was a declaration. She had no price. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not applause, not awards, but a piece of land, a quiet home, and a name spoken with respect by people who once looked away. Have you ever watched a system bend? Not because it wanted to, but because someone refused to let it stand as it was? What if we stopped waiting for the right people to do the right thing, and started being the reason it's no longer possible to do the wrong one? Nora didn't burn down the auction yard. She didn't carry signs or start a campaign. She just lived. Loudly, steadily, unashamed. And that was enough to shift the ground beneath her town. The law changed, yes, but more importantly, perception changed. And that's always where real change begins. Not in the courtroom, but in the heart of a community forced to face what it once accepted. Nora became something more than a survivor. She became a mirror. And when the town looked at her, they couldn't unsee what they'd once ignored. That's the power of presence. That's the weight of one woman choosing herself over and over again. And when history looks back, it won't just remember the law that changed. It'll remember the woman who did first. Some people measure time in years, others by seasons or scars or losses. But Nora, she stopped counting from the day of the auction. That chapter didn't define her anymore. Instead, she measured time by something far more powerful, the lives she helped steady. There was Anna, of course, the young girl she pulled out of a man's grip, the one who arrived at the cabin with silence stitched into her every movement. But over time, Anna laughed. She chopped wood. She stirred stew. She didn't ask permission to belong, and she didn't have to. She simply stayed. They didn't call each other family, not in the way papers or rings or rules demand. What they built was different, stronger in a way. It was made of unspoken understandings, of shared firelight and silent mornings, and knowing when to ask and when to just sit close. There was no title for it, but there was trust. And in a world that once stripped Nora of her name, that trust meant more than any label ever could. And maybe that's what legacy looks like. Not a monument, not a name carved into stone, but a life that rewrites what's possible for the ones who come after. Nora didn't set out to change the frontier. She wasn't a politician or a preacher. She didn't build a movement. She built a cabin. She built a home. She built herself, and that was enough to change everything. Word of her reached town and spread beyond it. People didn't talk about the sack over her head anymore. They talked about her strength. Not the loud kind, not the violent kind, but the kind that walks through fire and comes out carrying someone else. What kind of legacy do you want to leave? Are you building something others can rest in? Not just comfort, but truth. Not just survival, but dignity. Nora's story reminds us that you don't need permission to matter. You don't need to wait for the world to see your worth to start living like it's already there. She didn't burn the system down with fire. She dismantled it with presence, with the quiet, relentless act of standing upright where she once knelt, of choosing herself, then choosing others, and doing it over and over again. In the end, she wasn't just a woman who'd survived being sold. She became the woman who couldn't be priced. And in a place where people once whispered names, in shame they now spoke hers in reverence. Years later, they say that cabin still stands. Maybe the roof leaks, maybe the steps creak, but it holds stories that can't be erased. Stories of how a woman claimed herself, and in doing so, carved out space for others to do the same. That's legacy. Not in history books, but in hearts. So, here's the final truth. Nora didn't wait to be chosen. She chose herself. And in doing so, she gave us all permission to do the same.